Found true love at 70. After decades of solitude for over 40 years, my life was marked by deep silences, painful goodbyes, and a constant sense of invisibility. I believed that the days of love, enchantment, and new beginnings were behind me, that my destiny was merely to watch time pass alone. But amidst silent afternoons and dormant memories, an unexpected encounter changed the course of my story. What began with a simple glance exchanged in the town square gradually transformed into something I no longer believed possible. I rediscovered the beauty of feeling alive, desired, and most importantly, capable of loving and being loved again. Today at 70 years old I carry scars, yes, but I also carry a love that blossomed when no one else expected it, and I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. Routine had become my sole companion. Every day at 3 in the afternoon, I would prepare a cup of chamomile tea, drape my shawl over my shoulders, and sit in the armchair by the window. The books on the small table no longer called to me as they once did. They were there more as mementos than as distractions. With each page marked by old creases, I relived the days when I still believed in happy stories. But now they were just objects witnessing the passage of time. Much like myself, I observed the town square in front of my house, as one who watches a world they no longer participate in. Children played, couples shared benches, and young people hurried by, laughing at things I no longer understood. Time seemed slower for me, dragging between lukewarm sips of tea and memories that never returned. Sometimes I wondered if anyone would notice my absence, should I decide not to appear at the window. But the wind was always the same, indifferent. The leaves on the trees danced to the sound of an autumn that arrived slowly, like everything in my life. It had been years since anyone rang my doorbell unless it was by mistake or a wrong delivery. The loneliness no longer hurt. It had become a part of me, like an old blanket that no longer warms but comforts. What was once anguish turned into silence. A deep silence that echoed through every room of the house. On that day, however, something changed. Perhaps it was the way the sun streamed through the curtain or the different tone of the wind. But it was when my eyes rested on a solitary old man sitting on a bench in the town square that something long dormant stirred within me. His calm demeanor, his contemplative posture. There was something there that didn't belong to the gray everyday. That ordinary afternoon, I saw a man sit on the park bench, and something within me awoke that I hesitated for a few days before approaching. The old man always appeared at the same time, with a book in his hands and a distant look. On Wednesday, I gathered my courage and sat on the bench beside him, as if by chance. "Good afternoon," he said in a gentle voice. I replied with a timid smile, surprised by my own boldness. I couldn't remember the last time I struck up a conversation with a stranger. His name was Jonathan Parker. I discovered he was a widower like me, and had moved to town a few months ago. He told me about his passion for painting, and I spoke of my books even though I didn't read them as much anymore. We talked about small things, the weather, flowers, old music, and everything seemed to have a new meaning. It wasn't what we said but how we said it. There was comfort in that simplicity. Time passed too quickly, and when we said goodbye, I felt an emptiness I hadn't known. It was different from loneliness. It was a longing that arose even before the absence. I walked back home with cold hands and a warm heart. I had laughed, truly laughed, and it unnerved me. How could something so simple have such an effect? Perhaps I was just yearning for connection. But when I looked back, he was still there, watching me tenderly. His eyes were not those of a stranger. There was an ancient calm in them, as if they knew my fears before I even voiced them. And when he smiled, something inside me believed. He smiled as if he had known me from another life, that I ascended the steps of my house like someone returning from a long journey. My legs trembled, but not from effort. It was my heart, racing, realizing it still beat for something beyond routine. I leaned against the door for a few seconds before entering, trying to understand what was happening. What was this pleasant restlessness? This mix of joy and apprehension? The walls of the house seemed less oppressive, as if someone's presence outside had illuminated my world within. I prepared my tea as usual but couldn't drink it. I walked from room to room, smiling to myself like a young girl. I was alive, and only now did I realize how dead I had felt inside before this. Jonathan wasn't just a friendly old man on a park bench. He carried within him a promise that there was still time. Time to start over, to feel, to dream. And that, in itself, was a miracle. My heart, which had feared so much, now opened, albeit cautiously. I didn't know if it was love, but it was hope. In the mirror, I faced a version of myself I hadn't seen in a long time. My eyes sparkled. There was color in my face, life in my wrinkles. Everything about me seemed to remember what it was like to feel. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to allow myself to feel. But the fear of being deluded returned with every step, like an ancient echo. The morning seemed ordinary until I decided to reorganize some old boxes in the attic. It was rare for me to go up there, but something drew me to that dusty, silent space. Among yellowed albums and forgotten recipe books, I found a small wooden box, tied with a faded ribbon. When I opened it, I felt a shiver. Inside, there were letters carefully stacked, dated from the 1970s. My heart raced even before I started reading. With trembling hands, I picked up the first one. The smell of aged paper transported me back to a youth full of hopes. As I read the sweet and anxious words, his voice filled my mind. Richard, the only one who dared to say he loved me, but who mysteriously disappeared from my life. The last time I saw him, he seemed about to tell me something important, but he never returned. Now the letters spoke what he never could. The words spoke of dreamed encounters, postponed plans, apologies for silences he didn't want to keep. Each sentence was a reopened wound, but also a piece of a puzzle that never made sense. I cried softly, like someone re-encountering a lost part of themselves. Why had these letters never reached me? I shook my head, trying to understand. The dates matched the months I waited for answers. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been silenced by something, or someone. And there, amidst that stuffy attic, I realized that my story could have been different. I recognized the handwriting. It was his. But why had I never known about these letters? I descended the stairs with the box in my arms, as if carrying a piece of myself that had been stolen. I called Abigail, my sister, asking her to come to my house. She arrived with her usual demeanor, practical, reserved, as if emotions were dangerous. I showed her the letters without saying a word, just observing her reaction. Her face paled even before I asked anything. I did this for you, Eleanor, she said, trying to remain calm. At the time, I thought I was sparing you from disillusionment. I was momentarily paralyzed. It was hard to understand how someone could hide something so important under the guise of protection. She explained that she intercepted the letters when we lived together, and believed Richard wasn't trustworthy. But who was she to decide for me? The anger didn't come immediately, sadness did, mourning for a life that could have been. Abigail spoke as if she was still certain of her decision, as if love was always a risk to be avoided. You were too fragile, Ellie, she justified. But at that moment I felt that fragility lay in those who feared love, not in those who desired it. She tried to touch my arm, but I recoiled. There weren't enough words to undo that past. I needed time. The box was now more than an object. It was a mirror of what had been taken from me. And within me a new rebellion began to grow. I wanted my story back. My own sister decided for me what I should feel. The house was silent after Abigail left, but my mind was not. I went to the garden and sat on the wooden bench, holding one of the letters as if it were an anchor. For a long time I let others lead my destiny, afraid of displeasing, of getting hurt. But now, with those words of love in my hand, I understood how much I had been shaped by the fear of others. Not by my own. Richard might have failed, yes, but the right to try was mine. I felt I had wasted precious years, caught between prudence and obedience. The pain of not knowing was always greater than the pain of having loved in vain. But not anymore. Jonathan came to my mind like a still burning flame. A new chance I didn't want to lose. I stood up and walked to the makeshift studio I used to store old books. I picked up my notebook and began to write. Not for anyone else, but for myself. I wanted to record that this time my choice would be free. It was a pact with myself. Life might not give me time for all new beginnings, but it was giving me this one. Not. I took a deep breath, smelling the falling afternoon. I was no longer the same Eleanor who drank tea looking out the window. I was awake. And if fate insisted on testing me, let it come with everything it had. This time I would choose for myself. Jonathan invited me to visit his studio on a quiet late afternoon, the sky painted with copper tones. I accepted with a knot in my stomach, curious and apprehensive. The place was a small shed in his backyard, with high windows and the characteristic smell of paint, wood, and time. Upon entering, I was overcome by a strange sensation, as if I were stepping into something deeper than a simple room. The covered canvases, the worn brushes, everything there breathed history. He carefully pulled back the cloths, revealing scenes of the sea, childhood portraits, and faces that seemed to whisper old emotions. I paused before one particular painting, a woman seated under an oak tree, her eyes turned towards the horizon. My heart pounded. The figure, though younger, was strikingly similar to me. The shape of her face, her distant gaze, even the way she crossed her hands in her lap. Jonathan approached slowly, as if he too felt the impact of that image. "This painting is over 20 years old," he said, without taking his eyes off me. I confessed that I saw myself there, that it unsettled me. He smiled hesitantly. "Perhaps you lived inside me before you arrived here." I was speechless that I stood there, before that image, unsure what was coincidence and what was destiny. My eyes burned. That woman was me, in some way it was me. It was as if he had painted my face before he even knew me. That we sat near the studio fireplace, where he offered me black tea with honey and a respectful silence. After a few minutes, he began to speak, as if unburdening himself. "I need you to know about my wife, Eleanor. Before you go any deeper." I looked into his eyes, and what I saw there was shadow and pain. She wasn't easy, and our story ended bitterly. Jonathan recounted that his wife, Marianne, suffered from intense emotional crises, often accompanied by impulsive and aggressive behaviors. For years I tried to help her, but I always felt I was failing. Their last night was marked by an argument. He went out for air and when he returned she was gone. The report mentioned an accident, but the suspicions and whispers never ceased. His pain came not just from the loss, but from the doubt. I'll never know if I was negligent, or if I was a victim of her chaos. His eyes filled with restrained tears. He confessed that, even after everything, he still loved her. Or at least, loved what he dreamed with her. And now, for that very reason, he hesitated to open himself to someone again. My heart ached. It wasn't an easy past to hear, but there was a raw truth there, unembellished. Jonathan had nothing for me, and that touched me deeply. She didn't die in peace, and I carry the guilt to this day. I left the studio with a throbbing head. Each step on the sidewalk seemed to echo within me. On one hand, I felt intense empathy for Jonathan. He had been hurt by a shattered story, marked by sadness and judgment. On the other hand, an ancestral fear warned me. What if I was entering a whirlpool of pains that weren't mine? What if, in trying to heal someone, I lost myself again? The image of the painting wouldn't leave my mind. It was impossible not to wonder. Why me? How could someone who had never seen me before have portrayed a soul so similar to mine? The connection between us seemed to precede time itself. But perhaps precisely because of that it was dangerous. Two souls marked by loss can recognize each other, or sink together. It wasn't a lack of feelings. On the contrary, I felt more than I was ready to admit. But fear now had another name, past. And it hovered between us like a shadow that insisted on returning. I walked slowly, touching the walls of my house as one seeking support. I needed to think, reflect, protect myself. That night before sleeping, I looked at the dark sky and wondered if broken hearts also have a chance to bloom. Perhaps, but with care, with truth, with courage. Can love blossom over the ashes of another's pain? It wasn't long before Abigail found out about Jonathan. A casual visit was enough for her to notice the change in my face, the books out of place, the different perfume lingering in the air. She crossed her arms, her gaze filled with judgment. "You're getting involved with that man from the square, aren't you?" I didn't answer immediately, and my silence was all the confirmation she needed. "This isn't going to end well, Eleanor." She spoke for minutes on end, as if reciting an ancient speech. She said that men like him hide secrets, that my heart is too vulnerable, that I'm being swept away by belated illusions. He's a mysterious widower with a dark past. You'll get hurt. I looked at her, trying to find the protective sister I once knew, but all I saw was control and fear. It was as if time had frozen her affections in rigidity. That I tried to explain that Jonathan made me feel alive, that it wasn't a blind impulse, but a slow discovery. Do you think this is what love is at 70? She said sarcastically. That's just loneliness. The words cut deep, but not as much as what came next. You're being manipulated, Eleanor. He sees your loneliness and uses it. I swallowed hard, unsure how to react. It was hard to hear all this coming from someone who grew up beside me. But at that moment I understood that my sister saw love as a threat, not as a cure. You're being manipulated, Eleanor. Don't see this as love. Hours later, Brandon stopped by to visit and found me downcast, drinking cold tea on the porch. A single glance was enough for him to sense the weight in my expression. I sat beside him, told him about the conversation with Abigail, about the doubts and fears that returned like waves. He listened patiently, then held my hands firmly. Grandma, sometimes people love us the wrong way because they're afraid to see us happy without them. He shared something he had never said before. A few years ago, he fell in love with a coworker, someone completely outside the family's expected norm. He heard criticisms, advice disguised as concern, but decided to follow his heart. Today they are together, happy, overcoming the judgments. If I had let fear speak louder, I would have lost the love of my life. I was moved. Brandon was young, yes, but his soul carried a rare maturity. He saw me as a whole woman, not as an old lady to be spared from disillusionment. Pain is part of the package, Grandma, but it's also part of life. And life is what we have now, not what's left behind. His words pierced me like a breath of freedom. He hugged me and said with a calm smile, "Don't let others' past steal your present." And at that moment, the breeze seemed lighter. Love is always a risk, but a life without it is a certainty of emptiness. That night, I stared at my reflection in the mirror for long minutes. My face, marked by time, still held traces of the dreamy woman I once was. I took a deep breath and put on my best blue dress, the one I only wore on special occasions. Not out of vanity, but as a silent ritual of affirmation. I went out for a walk to the town square, even without knowing if he would be there. It wasn't about him. It was about me. Jonathan was indeed sitting on the same bench as always. Seeing me, he stood up with surprise and a gentle smile. We sat side by side, and the silence between us was comfortable, almost complicit. He told me about a new painting he had started inspired by the sunset, or perhaps by me, he joked. And I laughed, feeling my chest open a little more. I didn't say anything about Abigail, or the old letters or the fears. For now it was enough to be there. I didn't want to miss another chance at living because of other people's opinions or ghosts that didn't belong to me. I was tired of fleeing true feelings for illusory security. For the first time, the present was more important than the past. Whether it would be love or not, time would tell. But I was willing to find out. If it's an illusion, at least let it bring me joy while it lasts. Brandon arrived on a rainy afternoon, carrying a picture frame covered with a cloth. He had come to visit a friend and by chance entered a local antique shop. Among trinkets and old furniture, he found a set of paintings signed by a certain R. Evans. One of the paintings, however, made him stop. When the seller said that this collection was part of an old collection of his grandfather, Richard, Brandon didn't hesitate. He bought the piece and brought it to me. He unwrapped it slowly, almost ceremoniously. When I saw the painting, I put my hand to my mouth, incredulous. It was the same youthful face I saw in old photos, my face. The light blue dress, the hair tied to the side, the dreamy gaze. The image was clear, sharp, vibrant. Richard had portrayed me, perhaps as a memory, perhaps as longing, but why? I sat down slowly, trying to absorb what that meant. All these years I believed he had forgotten me, rejected me. But now, before that image, I realized that, even distant, he carried me with him. The painting was not just a memory. It was a silent confession of love that never had a voice. Brandon gently touched my shoulder. "Grandma, is that you?" How could he know? The painting wouldn't leave my mind. I took it with me to Jonathan's house that same week. I needed to share it to understand what it wanted to tell me or us. When I showed him the painting, he was silent for a few seconds, staring at the image as if he saw a ghost. "I've dreamed of that face before," he murmured almost to himself, "but I never knew it was real." Jonathan approached and touched the frame delicately. He said that, for years, he had painted faces that came to him in his dreams, always the same eyes, the same serene smile. He tried to forget them after his wife's death, but that figure kept returning to his canvases, like a whisper of destiny. When I first saw you in the square, I had such a strong déjà vu that I almost lost my breath. I remained silent for a few moments, my heart torn between past and present. Could it be that he had seen me without knowing me? Could love be a force that transcends even time? There were no rational explanations, only what we felt. And what we felt was real, vivid, urgent. Perhaps it wasn't a coincidence. Perhaps it was a reunion. We looked at each other for a long time, without the need for more words. Perhaps destiny began this story long before us. On the porch, illuminated by the golden light of late afternoon, Jonathan took my hand delicately. His touch was gentle, yet it carried a weight that traversed decades. I felt the warmth of his palm like a bridge between lives, between pains, between lost chances. The breeze rustled my hair, and everything seemed suspended, as in a slow dream. He approached slowly, as if asking for permission with his gaze. I closed my eyes and let the moment envelop us. The kiss was slow, reverent, full of meaning. It was like sealing a silent pact between two hearts that had been silent for too long. When we pulled away, there were tears in his eyes, and in mine too. It wasn't just passion. It was tenderness, respect, healing. We sat side by side for long minutes, just listening to the sounds of life around us. The distant sea, the birds among the leaves, the rhythmic beating of our hearts. Everything seemed to fit, as if time had finally set its hands right. It was the beginning of something new, and at the same time the end of a long wait. But the peace would not last as long as we would like. In the distance, something was preparing to test us. But the past, once again, threatened to exact its price. The doorbell rang on a cloudy late afternoon, breaking the serene silence of my house. I opened the door expecting to find Jonathan, but who stood there was a younger man, with a rigid posture and a suspicious gaze. "I'm Stephen, Jonathan's son." He entered without ceremony, like someone carrying urgent truths. The tension was palpable, and I soon understood that his visit was not friendly. He sat in the armchair opposite mine and, without beating around the bush, said, "Do you know who he really was, Mrs. Eleanor?" His words were sharp, and each sentence sounded like a veiled warning. According to him, his father's past was full of gaps, marital fights, rumors about his wife's death, years of reclusion. "My father knows how to hide secrets like no one else," he added. I tried to argue, to defend Jonathan, but Stephen seemed to have already formed his verdict. "He may be gentle, but he's a master at appearing harmless." He spoke with deep pain marked by old grudges. He was a wounded son, and wounded by someone I was starting to love. Doubt, however small, began to gnaw at me from within. What if he was right? Stephen stood to leave, leaving a heavy silence in the air. The door closed, but the words remained. "Do you know who he really was, Mrs. Eleanor?" I went to Jonathan's house the next morning, my heart heavy with the questions I couldn't silence. He greeted me with a restrained smile, as if he already knew what was coming. We sat on the porch, and with a deep sigh he began to speak. He admitted that his marriage to Marianne had been turbulent, full of ups and downs, of love and resentment. She was intense, and I often absent. He recounted that there was one night in particular, the last, when she snapped after an argument. He went for a walk, and when he returned, she was no longer alive. I never knew if my absence at that moment was the trigger, or just inevitable. There was pain in every word. He didn't claim innocence, but neither did he see himself as directly guilty, just someone who failed, as many fail. The silence between us was thick. I saw truth in his eyes, but I also saw a man who carried too many burdens. I tried to start over, Eleanor. But perhaps I don't deserve it. That phrase struck me like thunder. How could someone so sensitive believe so little in his redemption? I wanted to hug him, but I restrained myself. That moment, I didn't know what hurt more. The uncertainty about the past or the fear of losing what was just beginning. "Perhaps you shouldn't love me." The days that followed were filled with silence and confusion. I distanced myself from Jonathan, saying I needed time. And it was true. I walked alone on the beach, trying to find some clarity in the waves. Faces mingled in my mind. Stephen's with his accusing eyes and Jonathan's with his silent pain. I was in the middle of a field that wasn't mine, but where my heart had already been planted. Alice came to visit me, trying to distract me with her romantic tales and optimistic words, but even she realized I was elsewhere. I wasn't sleeping well, nor eating right. I felt like before Jonathan. Empty, aimless. But now the difference was that I knew what it was to feel, and that made the absence even more painful. I thought of Richard, of Abigail, of the hidden letters, of the choices that were taken from me. And now again, fear tried to steal my chance to be happy. But I still didn't know if it was fear or instinct. Was Jonathan telling the truth? Or was he too, like many, just hiding his version of events? The sound of the sea lulled me but did not calm my conflict. My heart said yes, but fear screamed no. It was on a gray morning without any warning. I was preparing my tea when everything around me seemed to spin. I felt a strange numbness in my left arm and the cup fell from my hand, shattering on the floor. I tried to get up, but my legs wouldn't obey. The world went silent, as if it had been turned off. The last thing I remember was the distant sound of the phone ringing. I woke up in a white room, with machines beeping at a slow rhythm. The nurse smiled at me with relief, and then Abigail appeared, red eyes, rigid posture. It was a small stroke, Ellie. You were lucky. Lucky? The word sounded strange. I tried to speak, and despite my weak voice, the words came out. I was lucid, but my body still felt like thin paper. Everything hurt. The doctor said I would have a good recovery, as long as I respected my body's time. But time that I no longer had in abundance. While everyone talked around me, my mind wandered to Jonathan. I wondered if he knew, if he had come. I also thought about the words I left unsaid. My body failed, yes, but it was my heart that cried out first. I closed my eyes and let a tear fall. It wasn't fear of death. It was regret for having stopped living. When I woke up, my memory was intact, but my heart felt fragile. Abigail took over my recovery as if it were a mission. She cared for me with diligence, but also with control. She decided the schedules, the visitors, what I could or couldn't do. It was her way of loving, I knew. But there was an emptiness she couldn't fill, and that emptiness had a name. You need peace, not confusion, she said when I mentioned Jonathan's name. He's not part of this. But he was. He was because he was a part of me now, even if everything had been so recent. I asked for the phone, but she deflected. I insisted, and her eyes filled with tears. He called, yes, several times. But I thought it better for you to rest first. The pain I felt at that moment wasn't physical. It was a kind of silence that suffocates. My voice came out stronger than I expected. I want to see him. Abigail hesitated. For the first time in years, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't ready to lose me, and that fear made her push away anything that seemed unstable. But love isn't stability. Love is a choice, and I still wanted to choose while I could. I don't want to leave with unsaid words, I repeated, firmly. My sister left the room in silence. I stayed there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for someone to bring me back to what could still be lived. I don't want to leave with unsaid words. In the late afternoon, the bedroom door opened slowly. It was him. Jonathan entered with restrained steps, as if he feared breaking something around me. His eyes were red, his hands trembled, but there was a hidden smile at the corner of his lips. When we looked at each other, time seemed to stop. Everything that hadn't been said in the previous days fit into that gaze. He approached, sat beside me, and held my hand. Neither of us spoke for a while. We just let the touch speak. Then he began to recount what the days without me had been like. The frustrated visits, Abigail's ignored messages, the fear of never seeing me again. And I told him how much I had thought of him, even without strength. We cried together. Not from pain but from relief. We were alive. There was still a chance. You might not believe it, Eleanor, but I prayed for you. His voice wavered. Even without knowing how to pray properly. I smiled weakly but fully. You don't need to know how to pray. Just to feel. And there, among machines and white sheets, I felt more alive than in many of my healthy days. He kissed my forehead, with the affection of someone who has already lost, but also of someone who knows the value of finding again. The sun filled the room, painting everything with golden tones. At that moment, hope was reborn, timid but firm. Was there still time for love? The rain began in the morning and didn't let up all day. Strong winds blew through the windows and the tree branches seemed to dance in despair. The streets became empty, and people retreated into their homes, as if nature demanded silence. I watched the storm from my armchair, with a blanket on my legs and a forgotten cup of tea beside me. With each thunderclap, something within me also trembled. That's when I heard the knock at the door. Jonathan, drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead and his eyes more intense than ever. I couldn't wait until it passed. He came in, took off his wet coat, and stood there, observing me as if he feared I would disappear. I simply opened my arms and let him sit beside me. Time no longer allowed for hesitation. We remained silent for a few moments, listening to the fury outside. I thought I'd never see you again after the hospital, he said. I just shook my head. I thought so too. But here we are. The words didn't need rehearsing. They came from the depths of something that had survived everything. And in that small house with the world falling apart outside, what mattered most was what remained between us. Because sometimes the heart only finds peace when it faces its own storm. Outside it rained incessantly, but it was inside me that the storm roared. Jonathan held my hand, still trembling. If you want me to leave, I understand, he said, his voice choked. I took a deep breath and released the words I had been holding for years, perhaps decades. Jonathan, I spent my life trying to protect myself. From pain, from loss, from regret. And do you know what I gained from that? Solitude. Silence. Too late. He tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand, asking him to let me continue. If I'm to suffer, let it be for having loved, not for having hidden myself. My words were firmer than I imagined. I felt the weight lift from my chest, like a valve that finally opened. I prefer to live what we have, even with uncertainties, than to die wondering what it would have been like. Jonathan was crying now, silently, like someone listening to something sacred. And within me, something was also being liberated. I looked at him with the intensity of someone who finally understands that life doesn't wait for those who hesitate. If you leave, Jonathan, at least I'll know I was loved. He leaned in, rested his forehead against mine, and there we stayed, breathing together, as if the world didn't exist beyond that instant. Love, when true, doesn't need guarantees, only courage. The storm raged outside, but inside, love became a refuge. If you leave, Jonathan, at least I'll know I was loved. The wind began to calm as he pulled me closer, and in that gesture there was more than affection, there was decision. I'm not leaving, Eleanor. Not again. We hugged for a long time, and for the first time I felt that our fears would no longer separate us. We were there, two survivors of a life full of absences, choosing at last to remain. Not for the time that remained, but for the intensity of now. We spent the night talking about everything we had previously avoided. We talked about Marianne, Richard, Stephen, and Abigail. No ghost remained unnamed. It was time to make space for the new, without erasing what had shaped us. Jonathan kissed my hands as if thanking each wrinkle, each memory. And I, at last, allowed myself to rest, not from the world, but from the resistance that kept me from happiness. The next morning, the sky opened shyly, still cloudy but without rain. The smell of wet earth was the scent of renewal. We made coffee together like an old couple, as if time had given us this scene as a gift. The words were few, a glance was enough. There were promises in the silence, and that was enough. Perhaps we didn't have much time, but now the time we had would be whole. Life owes us nothing, but it can still give us everything. Jonathan suggested a short trip, just the two of us, to a village near the sea. The place was simple, with stone streets and flowered windows, but there was something magical in the air. We walked hand in hand like teenagers, laughing at small things, taking photos, trying local sweets. I felt light, alive, as if age had kindly rolled back a few years. We slept in a cozy cabin, where even the silence tasted of peace. On that trip we dreamed again. We painted a canvas together in the guest house garden, with colors we didn't even know how to combine. We visited a craft fair, where he bought me a necklace with a small blue stone, saying it matched my eyes, even though they weren't as blue as they once were. But at that moment the beauty didn't come from the eyes but from the gaze. We were whole despite the scars. During an especially warm afternoon, we lay under a gazebo and talked about our first loves, our old fears, our belated hopes. We laughed at coincidences, cried over longings, and sealed that moment with a calm kiss. full of gratitude. There, no past weighed us down, only the present embracing us. Living again had never been so sweet. It was like living a lost chapter of my adolescence. On the penultimate day of the trip, I received an unexpected message. Stephen wanted to talk. I confess I feared for a moment, but Jonathan just nodded, calm. We met at a seaside cafe, and he seemed like a different man. More serene, less defensive. He apologized with sincerity in his eyes, saying he had let fear speak louder than love. My father was always a mystery to me, he began. But I don't think I've ever seen him as whole as he is now. He said he had been reflecting on life, and that perhaps parental love was also a form of mirror. I judged without understanding, and that was unfair to both of you. Jonathan simply touched his son's shoulder and smiled. It takes time for some truths to settle, he replied with the wisdom of someone who had carried the burden of silence for a long time. I just watched, moved. Stephen looked at me with a new sparkle in his eyes. You know, I realized you make him smile like I've never seen before. It was simple but powerful. The acceptance came not as a plea for forgiveness, but as an acknowledgement of what is true. And at that moment, I realized that love transforms, even at a distance. Even among ruins, that I returned to the cabin with a peaceful heart. A cycle was closing. Not with shouts but with understanding. I realized you make him smile like I've never seen before. When we returned home, Abigail was waiting for us on the porch. There was no criticism in her gaze, only a strange mix of weariness and tenderness. We sat in the garden, and she was silent for a while until she spoke, looking at me with a sincerity I hadn't seen in a long time. I don't understand this path you've chosen, Eleanor. But today I see that it has made you blossom. The words came out softly, but laden with truth. She admitted that her way of loving had always been rigid, shaped by loss and the fear of suffering. Perhaps I protected you too much. Or in the wrong way. I took her hand, and for the first time there was no resentment, only recognition. We were, in a way, rediscovering each other too. She looked at me with tear-filled eyes and said, "If he makes you happy, then let him stay." In the following days, Abigail began to visit more, bringing cakes, stories, and even smiling with Jonathan. They didn't become best friends, but there was respect. And for us, that was enough. Learning to accept is a gesture as powerful as learning to love. And now, even my sister understood that. We were no longer prisoners of a frozen past. The house seemed larger, the air lighter. Finally, everything was falling into place. Resistance turned into a blessing, and love prevailed. We transformed the backyard into a refuge of colors. Jonathan and I spent our mornings working the soil, choosing seedlings, and designing paths among the flowers. It wasn't just a garden. It was a piece of everything we had learned. Patience, care, new beginnings. Each sprouting plant was like a reminder that life persists, even when we think it's over. It was our way of thanking time for bringing us together, even so late. Jonathan liked sunflowers. I preferred lavender. He said they resembled me. Discreet but with a lasting fragrance. We also planted daisies, white roses, and even basil, just to feel its scent invade the kitchen. It was comforting to see our hands together in the earth, building something that would remain even when we were no longer there. The garden was a testament to what we cultivated within ourselves. Many afternoons ended with tea on the wooden bench among the flower beds. We didn't talk much, it wasn't necessary. The simple fact of being there, alive together, was more than any words could express. Jonathan smiled with his eyes and I smiled with my soul. We were two stories that intertwined late, but with depth that we planted flowers, yes, but also forgiveness, lightness, and love. Each flower was a memory planted with hope. The idea arose on one of those tranquil afternoons. What if we did something for others like us? People who also believed it was too late? We then organized a gathering at the town's community hall, with cake, tea, and old music. We put up invitations in markets, bakeries, and churches without great pretensions. On the appointed day, the hall felt small compared to the hearts that gathered there. Widowers came, divorced individuals, those lonely due to shyness or neglect. Some with flowers in their hands, others with suspicious eyes, but all with stories ready to be retold. Jonathan held a small art exhibition, and I read a text about new beginnings. And it was there, in that simple setting, that I realized how much a single gesture can transform worlds. Souls once silent now conversed, laughed, danced out. We organized new monthly meetings. We created a small reading group, outdoor walks, even painting classes. Loneliness began to lose ground to true connections. And with each gaze that lit up, we knew we were doing something bigger than ourselves. Jonathan used to say that love has no age, and love there was in everything. What was ours now blossomed in many. If a story like ours can exist, many others can too. On a serene afternoon, I sat at my desk and decided to write a letter. But it wasn't for Jonathan, nor for anyone I knew today. It was for myself at 30 years old. That woman full of doubts, long waits, and painful silences. I wrote as if holding her hand, telling her she hadn't failed, that everything she felt was real and that one day life would make sense, even if it took time. That I told her that love would come, yes, but not in a hurry, nor in the form of perfect tales. It would come with wrinkles, with rich stories and hands intertwined in pain and healing, that she would still know new smiles, unseen places, and herself as never before. That time, though relentless, is also generous when we let it be. And that the end of the road isn't always sadness. It can be a meeting. That I folded the letter and put it in an envelope, sealing not the paper but the cycle. There were no more loose ends, no ghosts. The past was now a bridge, not a prison. I took a deep breath, looking out the window where Jonathan tended to the flowers with his crooked straw hat and boyish smile. And it was at that moment that I realized, time didn't take everything from me. It brought me you. Now, I'm curious about you who heard my story. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Have you experienced anything similar? Support the channel by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing this video. I'm leaving another story on the final screen that you'll also enjoy, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.